Hey everyone, welcome to the 6th lesson of Pre-algebra. Today we're going to be learning about what absolute values are and how to apply them to different equations. So starting off with the basic definition, U is the calculation of the distance from 0. So its notation looks like two lines like this. And if I put a number in here like 2, this would be the way to write the absolute value of 2. So if I draw a number line here, and let's say 0 is right here in the middle. Now when I say the distance from 0, that also means that the distance can never be negative, because if you think about it, you can never be, like, for example, negative 6 miles away from someone. Distance is always positive. So if I asked for the absolute value, then the absolute value would be equal to just 2, because it's 2 away from 0. Now, that's not the only number with the absolute value of 2. If you have the absolute value of negative 2, that would also be 2, because if I plot negative 2 on the number line, you can see that that is also just 2 away from 0. Negatives don't really matter, you're just calculating distance, so that all values of absolute value will always be positive. Let's take a look at a few examples. So if I had the absolute value of negative 3, think about how far away negative 3 is from 0. The answer to this is 3. So the absolute value of negative 3 is, now let's try, let's try 9. So the absolute value of 9 is just simply 9, because it's 9 away from 0. If you need to visualize this, feel free to draw out one yourself. Let's do another negative number. How about negative 100? Negative 100 is just 100 away from 0. Notice that all these numbers are positive, the resulting numbers are positive, because distance can never be negative. The same goes for positive 6. The absolute value will be 6 because it's 6 away from 0. Now let's try solving some simple equations with this. So what if you had something like value of negative 3 plus 8? Well, to solve this, you first calculate the absolute value of negative 3, which is just positive 3. So this is simply just positive 3 plus 8, which is equal to 11. Let's try another one. Absolute value of negative 11 plus absolute value of negative 1. This time we have two absolute values, so let's solve them separately. So what's the absolute value of negative 11? Well, that's just simply 11 away from 0, so that's positive 11. The same goes for negative 1. It's 1 away from 0. So this is just actually 11 plus 1, which we know is 12. Let's do negative 2 plus the absolute value of negative 4. Always evaluate the absolute value first. So the absolute value of negative 4 is just simply positive 4. So this is negative 2 plus 4, which is equal to 2. Minus the absolute value of negative 5. The absolute value of negative 5 is just 5, so this is 20 minus 5, which is equal to 15. Let's try the absolute value of negative 17 plus 3. The absolute value of negative 17 is positive 17, and plus 3 is 20. And let's do one last one. How about 6 minus the absolute value of negative 7. The absolute value of negative 7 is positive 7, so this is just 6 minus 7, which is equal to negative 1. Now we're going to work with variables with absolute value. So we learned about what variables are in our last lesson and how to use them. So we did equations like this last lesson. X minus 10 equals 3. And we know that we need to isolate the variable, which will get us to x equals 13 because you add 10 on both sides. Now this is different from with absolute value. What if you had minus 10 equals 3? You wouldn't treat this like a regular equation, like the one above, and add 10 to each side. Instead, we have to negate one side to solve this equation. You can think of this equation as the distance between x and 10 is 3. So what numbers are 3 away from 10? That's 2 numbers because, as we mentioned before, the distance from 0 can be resulted in 2 different numbers, one negative and one positive. And this is the same case for this. So this can either be x minus 10 equals 3 or x minus 10 equals negative 3. So there's 2 answers for this. Let's solve this on a different sheet. So let's go with the first equation first. X minus 10 equals positive 3. We would solve this like we did earlier, and it would just equal x equals 13. Now for the second equation, it would be x minus 10 equals negative 3. You add 10 to both sides, and you get x equals 7. So you have 2 answers here, and this is because there's always 2 different ways to get to a middle point. This is better explained by a number line. So I have a number line here, and we're going to put 10 in the middle because, like I said earlier, the absolute value of x minus 10 equals 3 is another way of saying the distance between x and 10 is 3. And we said the values of x is 13 and 7. This is because if you go 3 to the right, you get 11, 12, 13. And then if you go 3 to the left, you get 9, 8, and 7. So as you can see here, 7 and 13 are both 3 away from 10, which is the middle ground. This is why the absolute values equations always have 2 different answers. Let's do some more example problems. 7 minus x equals 7. So, like I said earlier, this can be solved as 7 minus x equals 7, like how it seems, or you can do x equals negative 7. Let's start with the left equation. We're going to add x on both sides just to get rid of the negative. So that's going to be 7 equals 7 plus x. Now we're going to subtract 7 from both sides. That's going to be x equals 0. Now let's try the next equation. Add x on both sides. And that equals 7 equals negative 7 plus x. And then add 7 once again. That's going to get you x equals 14. So our answers are x equals 14 and x equals 0. How about x minus 5 equals 3? We separate this into 2 equations again. X minus 5 equals 3 and x minus 5 equals negative 3. Let's start with the left equation. Add 5 on both sides to isolate the variable. X equals 8. Add 5 on both sides to the equation on the right. 5 plus negative 3 is equal to positive 2. So our answers are 8 and 2. How about x minus 2 is equal to 16? We're going to split it up again into x minus 2 equals 16 and x minus 2 equals negative 16. That's going to get you to x equals 18 and x equals negative 14. How about x minus 1 equals negative 4? Split it up. X minus 1 equals negative 4, or x minus 1 equals positive 4. X equals negative 3 on this side, and on the right side, x equals 5. Let's do x plus 8 equals 5. Once again, we're splitting it up into x plus 8 equals 5 and x plus 8 equals negative 5. Subtract 8 on both sides. That's negative 3. Subtract 8 on both sides over here too, and that's equal to negative 42. Sorry, this is 13. Now let's try some harder ones. We're going to throw in the variable with a coefficient. But this is solved in the same way as we did the other equations. 2x plus 3 equals 5, and 2x plus 3 equals negative 5. We're going to first subtract 3 on both sides and get 2. And then we're going to divide by 2 to isolate the variable, and we get 1. Same thing on this side. Subtract 3 on both sides, negative 8, divide by 2, negative 4. Let's try 6x minus 2 equals 4. We're going to get 6x minus 2 equals 4, and 6x minus 2 equals negative 4. Do first on both sides, divide by 6, and you get x equals 1 as your first answer. And then for the second one, you add 2 on both sides again, divide by 6 equals negative 2 over 6, which is equivalent to negative 1/3. How about 5x plus 1 equals 2? Split it up into 5x plus 1 equals 2, and 5x plus 1 equals negative 2. You first subtract 1 on both sides, and then divide by 5. Same thing for this side. X equals negative 3/5. 2x minus 3 equals 11. 2x minus 3 equals 11. 2x minus 3 equals negative 11. 2x equals 14, x equals 7. 2x equals negative 8, x equals negative 4. Let's do 4x plus 5 equals 13. 4x plus 5 equals positive 13, and 4x plus 5 equals negative 13. 4x equals 8, x equals 2. X equals negative 18, and then x equals negative 18 over 4. So x is equal to negative 9 over 2. You should be getting the hang of it by now. We're going to move on to more complicated problems soon. So let's do one last one of these. Negative 3x plus 4 equals positive 5. Negative 3x plus 4 equals negative 5. You're going to subtract 4 on both sides first. And then x equals negative 1/3. Negative 9 divided by negative 3 is positive 3. So we got negative 1/3 and 3 as our answers. Now we're going to be going into equations with absolute values that have coefficients. So something like 4 absolute value x plus 8 absolute value equals 56. Now how do we deal with this? My advice to you is to just think of this absolute value as one big variable that you're trying to isolate, like you would do with a regular equation with x. So since we're trying to isolate this absolute value of this 4 that is in front of it, to get rid of the 4, we need to divide by 4 on both sides because it is multiplication. So if we divide 4 on both sides, we get 56 divided by 4, which is equal to 14. Now we can split it up into our regular 2 equations as always. And then you solve it like any other problem. So these are our answers. So let's do negative 10 x plus 2 equals negative 60. We first divide by negative 10 on both sides, so we get positive 6. And then it's as simple as that. We just split it into our 2 normal equations. Now let's try one with more than just a coefficient. So how about 4 times absolute value of 2x minus 1 absolute value minus 2 equals 34. So the first thing I would do here is add 2 on both sides to get rid of this number. So that would get us to 36. And now we divide by 4 on both sides, which would get us 2. And since the absolute value is now isolated, we can split it up into our 2 equations. Let's do 2 times 2x minus 4, absolute value equals 18. Divide by 2, and then split it up. This will get us to 13 over 2. And this gets us to negative 5 over 2. Now let's throw in a trickier one. What if the absolute value equation has x on both sides? So something that looks like this. Now you have more than one term on both sides. So how do we deal with this? This is actually just the same concept that I explained before with our two equations. But instead of just making one number negative, you have to negate the whole side. So this will look like negative parentheses 4 minus x parentheses. Let's go with the left side first. I'm going to add 3 on both sides, 3x on both sides, and then that's going to get us to 1. This side, let's first distribute the negative, and so you get negative 4 plus x. And then we solve it like any other normal equation. Let's do x equals negative 5. Let's do one last equation. 2 times absolute value of 4x minus 7 equals 26. We're going to divide this whole thing by 4x minus 7 equals 13. Divide that up. Four x minus 7 equals negative 13. And then add 7 on both sides, get 20. Divide by 4 on both sides, you get 5. So our first answer is x equals 5. Moving on to the right side, if you add 7 on both sides, you get negative 6. Then we're going to divide that by 4, negative 6 over 4, which we can simplify to negative 3 over 2, which is our second answer. So just remember to always treat the absolute value like one huge variable that you need to isolate to one side, and it will make things a lot easier. Or even, you can just make it a variable. And if you're confused by what I mean by this, let's take the equation from the last problem that we just did. So 4x minus 7 equals 26. And we're going to say on the side, let u equal 4x minus 7. So u is going to replace this absolute value if it makes it easier for you. So it's just going to be 2u equals 26. Now you just solve this like any other equation with a variable. You divide 2 on both sides and you get u equals 13. Now we plug u back in. So that's going to equal 4x minus 7 absolute value equals 13. And then you solve it like we did in the other page. So you do negative 4x minus 7 equals positive 13, and 4x minus 7 equals negative 13. So there are many different ways that you can solve absolute value, and you just need to make sure that your answer always makes sense. have for today. Keep in mind that you should always be practicing these concepts on your own so that you can get the hang of it. And feel free to use all the practice problems that I provided in this lesson. And I'll see you in our next lesson. Make sure to